Hi, this is Rita keeping it real, and we are reading through the scriptures. We're on First Maccabees Chapter 6, and I think really to get through this, I'm going to have to read more than one chapter every video. So I'm going to try to read from chapter 6 to chapter 9, so this may be a long video. Bear with me. Here we go. Find my little highlighter here. In case I want to highlight some things. Just one moment. Okay, so First Maccabees chapter 6. As King Antiochus the fourth was passing through Mesopotamia, he learned of the city. He heard of a city in Persia named, again, everybody, if you've been listening or you've heard any of these, you know I don't pronounce these names of these places or even the names of people right, so sometimes I just skip it. You can see it there. Elimaeus, which was famous for its riches in silver and gold. So this king heard of this city that had a lot of riches and gold. Now, what do we think he's going to do? The temple was very rich, containing gold shields, armor, and weapons left there by Alexander. Remember Alexander the Great? Remember, this is the reason we started reading this. Alexander the Great was from chapter 1. Remember Alexander the Great? Yep. So where were we? So. Okay. So the temple was very rich, containing gold shields, armor, and weapons left there by Alexander, son of King Philip of Macedonia, who was the first to rule the Greek Empire. He was the first to rule the Greek Empire. Okay, so Philip of Macedonia, who was the first to rule the Greek Empire. And I'm going to be reading from, I was reading from, looking at my computer screen and reading, but I'm not going to be able to do that because I'm going to be underlining. So I'll look up a little bit to make sure you can still see what I'm seeing. Anticochus came and tried to take the city and loot it, but he didn't succeed because the citizens had learned what he was planning to do, and they drew up their troops to resist him. In great frustration, he withdrew to return to Babylonia. In Persia, a messenger reached him with the news that the armies he had sent into Judea had been defeated. Lysias and his strong army had been forced to flee from the Jews, who were now reinforced by the additional weapons, supplies, and loot they had taken from the defeated army. So remember, they were fighting and winning and taking the loot and taking the people along the way, from chapters 3 on. The Jews had pulled down the thing they call what? The Jews had pulled down the thing they called the awful horror. And Anticochus had built on the altar in Jerusalem. What? The Jews had pulled down the thing they call the awful horror. Okay, so the Jews had pulled down this thing that the Jews call the awful horror that Anticochus had built on the altar in Jerusalem. Okay. They had also surrounded the temple with high walls as it had been before, and had taken and fortified the town of Bethzar, one of the king's own towns. When the king heard this report, he was so dumbfounded and terribly shaken that he went to bed in a fit of deep depression. That's him in his bed right here. Fit of deep depression because things had not turned out as he'd hoped. He waved as waves of despair swept over him until he finally realized that he was going to die. What? Jeez. He called together all the, suppose them, this is the second person that has died here. The first one was Matthias when he died. He was able to know he was dying, called his sons together and told them, who was going to take which part of the lead. I mean, it's not like many of us die on our deathbeds anymore, right? But these people are dying on their deathbed. They're on a deathbed dying and know they're dying. right? So he remained ill. Okay, here we go. He remained ill for a long time. I missed that part. That's why I didn't know. He remained ill for a long time as the waves of despair swept over him until he finally realized that he was going to die. He called together all those to whom he had taken the title. He called together all those who he had given the title. Wow. Who had given the title, friends of the king. Okay, remember he'd given this title. Some people get this title, friends of the king, and said to them, I cannot sleep, and my heart is broken with grief and worry. At first I asked myself why these great waves of trouble were sweeping over me, since I had been kind and well liked during my reign. So he thought he had been kind, and maybe he was, and well liked during his reign. But then I remembered the wrongs I did in Jerusalem, when I took all the silver and gold pieces from the temple and tried, without any good reason, to destroy the inhabitants of Judea. I know that this is why these terrible things have happened to me, and I'm about to die in deep despair here in this foreign land. Then he called Philip, one of his most trusted advisors, and put him in charge of his whole empire. He gave him his crown, robe, and official ring, and authorized him to educate his son Antiochus V and bring him up to be king. King Antiochus died there in the year 149. When Lysias learned that the king had died, he made the young Antiochus the king in place of his father. He had brought up Antiochus from childhood and now gave him the name Epator. That's different. Never heard that before. Okay, so this king has died. His son is, I guess, going to be king. So the campaign of Antiochus V and Lysias. Meanwhile, the enemies of the fort of Jerusalem. Meanwhile, the enemies of the fort of Jerusalem had been blocking the people of Israel in the area around the temple, constantly causing them trouble and giving support to the Gentiles. So Judas decided to get rid of them and called all the people together to besiege the fort. This is like a repeat. The people assembled and laid siege to the fort in the year 150. They built siege platforms and battering rams. But some of the men under siege escaped, and together with some of the renegade Jews, they went to the king. So they're renegade Jews. There's always renegades. How long are you going to wait before you take revenge for what was done to our countrymen? We were willing to serve your father, follow his orders, and obey his decrees. But what good did it do us? Now our own countrymen have become our enemies. In fact, they have killed as many of us as they can find and have stolen our possessions. But we are not the only ones they have harmed. They have attacked all of our neighbors. This is true. And now they have laid siege to the fort in Jerusalem and are planning to take it. They have also fortified the temple and Bethzar. Unless you act immediately, they will do even more, and you will not be able to stop them. When the king heard this, he was furious. He brought together all the army commanders and cavalry officers and his most trusted advisors. He also hired mercenary soldiers from other countries and from the Greek islands. His forces numbered 100,000. These people are getting bigger and bigger infantries. 20,000 cavalry and 32 elephants trained for war. Elephants trained for war? What? The king and his army passed through Edom and Nemea and laid siege to Bethzar, where they fought for a long time. They built battering rams, siege platforms, but the defeaters fought bravely and came out of the town and burned down the platforms. I'm probably going to read to chapter 7, because already I'm tired. So then Judas, because it's not like you could just read this because you're trying to picture it as you're going. So Then Judas withdrew his troops from the fort in Jerusalem and set up his camp at Beth Zachariah, blocking the advance of the king's army. Early the next morning, the king rapidly moved his army along the road to Beth Zachariah, where his troops took up battle positions and blew trumpets. Who did this? The king did this. They got the elephants ready for battle by showing them grape juice and mulberry juice. The huge animals were distributed among the infantry units. 1,000 men protected by chain armor and bronze helmets were stationed with each elephant. Each animal was also accompanied by a special force of 500 cavalry, which also remained with the elephant. A strong protected wooden platform was securely fastened. If you ever need a picture, this is when I need the picture. A strong protected wooden platform was securely fastened by the special harness to the back of each elephant. 3 soldiers rode on each animal, in addition to the elephant driver. Lysias placed the rest of the cavalry on the 2 flanks of the army where they could be protected by the infantry while harassing the enemy. The sunlight reflected off the bronze and gold shields shone on the mountains and flashed like burning torches. Part of the king's army was spread out over the higher ground of the mountain slopes and part over the lower lands, but they all moved forward steadily and in good order. All the people were terrified when they heard the noise made by the clashing of weapons and the marching of the great and powerful army. So it was like they coming like they in the 100,000. They got 32 elephants. Judas and his army advanced into battle and immediately killed 600 of the king's army. So 600 they killed right away. When Eleazar Averon saw that one of the elephants was larger than the others and that it was covered with royal armor, he thought that the king was riding on it. Eleazar sacrificed his life to save his people and to gain eternal fame. What? He ran boldly towards the elephant, which was in the middle of the battalion of infantry. He rushed forward, killing men to the right and to the left, so that the enemy of soldiers fell back before him on both sides. He slipped in under the elephant and stabbed it to death, and it fell on him and killed him. But when the Jews realized how strong the royal army was and how determined it was to fight, they retreated. The king and his army advanced to fight the Jews at Jerusalem. I'm sorry, guys. The king and his army advanced and to fight the Jews at Jerusalem and laid siege to the whole of Judea and Jerusalem. He made peace with the Jews of Bethzar just think about this. Somebody had to write all this down. I'm like challenged to read it, but somebody had to, it happened. Somebody had to record it, write it. Okay, this is a lot. Okay, so the king, start over verse 48. The king and his army advanced to fight the Jews at Jerusalem and laid siege to the whole of Judea and Jerusalem. So they're winning a little bit. He made peace with the Jews at Bethzar, who then left the town. There had not been enough food in the town for them to withstand the siege because it was a sabbatical year when no crops were planted. A sabbatical year when no crops were planted. The king occupied Bethzar and stationed a body of troops there to guard it. Then he surrounded the temple and besieged it for a long time. He set up siege platforms, battering rams, catapults from throwing fire and stones, and other weapons to throw spears and rocks. The defenders also made war machines to oppose those of the enemy, and so the battle went on for a long time. And all I can say is let's hope and pray that it is true that the Most High will fight our battles, because this is a whole lot of fighting strategy here, and I think about all that we've been through as a nation, all the separation, all the things that have been done to us. And I'm just trying to imagine us coming together like this and winning battles like this. But then you got to think the Most High can make anything possible, like he's doing here. So, verse 53. But there was no food left in the temple storage bins, because it was a sabbatical year, and the people who had fled from the Gentiles had taken refuge in Judea had eaten all the food that had been stored there. The storage of food had been so severe that many people had scattered to their homes, and only a few men were left in the temples. Meanwhile, Philip, who had been appointed by King Antiochus before his death to educate his son to be king, returned from Persia and Media. He had come back with the royal army and planned to take control of the government. When Lysias heard the news, he made rapid preparations to depart. He said to the young king, to the officers, and to his men, "We are growing weaker each day. We are short of provisions, and this place we are besieging is strong. Besides, there are pressing government affairs which need our attention. So now let's arrange a truce and make a peace treaty with the Jews and their whole nation." The Jews were a nation. The Jews still are a nation. We still are a nation. We are a nation. When you really think about that, we are a nation. We're not only a nation, but we're God's people, and we are his people in this nation. We will allow them to follow their own laws and customs as they did before. This is all we want. And this trouble started when we provoked them by abolishing their laws and customs. This recommendation was well received by the king and his officers. So Lysias proposed peace terms to the Jews, and they accepted them. Wonderful. When the king and his officers solemnly agreed to abide by these terms, the Jews came out of their fortress. But, here we go. When the king entered the temple area of Mount Zion and saw the strong fortifications, he broke his word and ordered the walls surrounding the temple to be torn down. And he hurriedly left and returned to Antioch, where he found Philip in control of the city. The king attacked the city and took it by force. I'm not sure I understand what just happened. So the king had an agreement with the Jews. He broke that agreement, tore down the walls around their temple, and then he went back to Antioch and found Philip, the guy that his father kind of put in charge over him until he got it together, controlling the city. And then the king attacked the city and took it by force. So this young king is not, he's not the nicest guy and doesn't keep his word. So, like I said, I thought I was going to read 7 and 8. That's a lot. I'm telling you, that's a lot. So, till the next time, signing off.